Good evening, and welcome to Calcutta Money. It's always lovely to have you back in the city. Well, last time you and I were paired in a conversation like this was in a panel discussion when we were discussing Jaswant Singh's massive tome on Jinnah.
Yes.
And I began the proceedings by saying that you could have 5 to 7 minutes for your opening statement, and you said, Rudrangshu, that's the time I take to clear my throat. Today, we are a little more relaxed with time, so I hope you can hold forth, as it were. I want to start with this word maverick, which is in the title of this book and also in the more recent one that's come out last month, I think,
yes.
Which is called Maverick in Politics. So, and I have always had the impression, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you rather wear this plume, Maverick, with some pride. And you accept it. If people call you a maverick and you accept it. But suppose one were to argue, as I'm going to do just now, that, you know, your career, if we look at it, has been fairly orthodox. One leading public school of the country, one of the leading colleges, Cambridge, then the Heaven-Born Service, the IFS, then, you know, one of the principal aides of Prince Charming, cabinet minister, and so on. So what is so maverick about this path, this trajectory?
I think the path itself shows that there's something unusual about it. To go back to the beginning, the word maverick came into the English language, or rather the American language, in the 19th century when a cattle herd keeper called Sam Maverick refused to brand his cattle. He just wouldn't do what everybody else did. The consequence was that he lost all his cattle, but his name has entered the English language, unlike any of his more successful cattle herder colleagues. So in a similar way, there are not very many people who in mid-career have switched from the certainties of the Foreign Service into the uncertainties of politics. That's one. The other is that even at school, I was, as I've explained in this book, I was a day scholar in what was really a boarding school, and I was hopeless at games. So in order to acquire a niche in the school's esteem, I learned how to kick with my left foot. Now that is a very maverick thing to do. And at Cambridge, while others went off to study, I spent all my time at the Union playing politics. And it was my colleagues at the Cambridge Union who became the principal ministers in the Margaret Thatcher and John Major governments. So and again, I was taken into the Prime Minister's office as a Foreign Service officer, but not to handle foreign affairs. In fact, what I handled most was Panchayati Raj, which is probably the immediate opposite of normal diplomacy. I then forced Rajiv Gandhi to let me come into politics. He warned me when eventually I persuaded him to let me make the transition. He said, this system will never accept you. And I didn't think that was true. I thought the system would. But now, after 35 years in politics, I see that he was right. And I sometimes think he was not telling me that the system will not accept you.
He was telling
himself. The system never accepted him.
You note that in passing, but I think it's a very significant point.
Yeah. So all this makes my career, despite its apparent conventional and rather orthodox trajectory, an unusual trajectory, and that's why I picked the word maverick. Maverick has two opposite significance. One is that is somebody who just disrupts. The other is that he does unorthodox things. And my family was very opposed to my using the word maverick for myself. And it was largely Veer Sanghvi who persuaded me to continue with this name. They were saying, why are you criticizing yourself by calling yourself a maverick? And I said, I'm not criticizing myself. I'm just saying my life has been unusual. And he said, what's wrong with being self-deprecatory? And so I stuck to it. And that's how Maverick appears in 2 of the 3 books.
So even before, for the record, even before you came to the PMO from the Foreign Service, actually you had done a stint in the INB ministry under Indira Gandhi.
That was awful. Indira Gandhi, you know, I have to give a little background.
Please.
On the 5th of June, 1984, Indira Gandhi made the terrible mistake of sending the Indian Army into the Golden Temple. And the fallout of that was politically dreadful for her. I was pulled out of the job which I was doing, which was Joint Secretary, United Nations, and asked to specifically appeal to the Sikh diaspora outside of India and to really convey to them only one message, although there were many ways in which this message was conveyed, that the Harmandir Sahib, which is the truly religious part of the Gurdwara, had not been targeted under the orders of the Prime Minister by the Indian Army. And that while the Akal Takht might have been destroyed, it was not a sanctum sanctorum. The sanctum sanctorum was the Harmandir Sahib, and in keeping with Sikh sentiment, she had ensured that however much firing might take place, none of the bullets would be directed towards the Golden Temple as such, the main Golden Temple. I'm not talking of the complex, I'm talking of the Harmandir Sahib. And she was so taken with the manner in which I did it, that instead of rewarding me for my virtues, she punished me for my virtues. She decided that she needed a good propagandist for a bad cause in the INB ministry on the eve of her elections in 1984. And so I was sent off to the INB ministry. And nobody there knew what to do with me. And I didn't know why I was sitting in this silly ministry with which I'd had nothing to do, and which was certainly not connected with the life of a Foreign Service officer. But as it turned out, and this is one of those coincidences that happen, as it turned out, she was assassinated later that year in October, and many people started suggesting to me that the only way I could get out of INB was to persuade Rajiv and his coterie to take me into the PMO and do this job, which I was supposed to be doing, and which I never did, outside from the Prime Minister's office. And that is how I came into the PMO. It's a long and complicated story.
Yeah, rather tortuous.
But I have explained it at some length.
It's rather a tortuous transition,
Yeah.
which you described. Now, since we
Well, there's only one point about that which I would like to share with this audience. It is that given the number of coincidences which have governed my life, which is what in many ways the first volume is about, I have always been challenged in my mind as to whether there is some supernatural being who is guiding our destinies, or whether what happens is the result of coincidences. And this dilemma was resolved for me when I read a sentence by Albert Einstein, in which he said that coincidence is God's way of hiding himself from humanity.
God works in mysterious ways. Well, there's a point there, I'll come back to it later on, but to deal with some of the main themes, you know, you walked, or should I say you strode, two intersecting corridors of power. You were there as a foreign service officer in some of the important chanceries across the world. Also there handling some of the important desks in the MEA. You were in the PMO, and you also walked the political corridors of power. They intersected. At some point they intersected out of your own choice, but when you were working with Rajiv Gandhi, they happened. You had to be, even though you were actually a bureaucrat, you had to deal with politicians and be involved in some way or the other with political decision making. So I want to ask you first, which of these did you prefer, looking back now? Which of these did you enjoy more?
I think I enjoyed them all. I've even enjoyed my exclusion now, because I'm getting plenty of opportunity to travel, which I never had before. And for once, I don't have to ask anybody permission to go where I want to go and spend as much time as I want wherever I am. But they were very different lives. The life at Cambridge was particularly exciting because that was my interface with politicians or potential politicians. And although it was a foreign country, not India, I learnt the ropes of what is to be done to get elected there. And there is a description of how I ended up as Secretary of the Union and how I almost made it to President in the shortest possible time that anybody in the history of the Cambridge Union has made it to President. But the most interesting part of that was that many years later, I learned from another Indian who was at Cambridge with us that Rajiv Gandhi, who was an undergraduate whom I didn't know, had gone around and asked a number of Indian students that, look, yaar, there's an Indian standing for president. The least you guys can do is to go and vote for him. So Rajiv began his political life canvassing for me. So isn't it appropriate that I should end my life canvassing for him?
In fact, you're very interesting. Your only encounter with Rajiv in Cambridge was when he said, "Are you expecting the floods?"
That's right.
Looking at your...
No, I've often said that the difference between Rajiv's Cambridge and mine was that Rajiv was escorting Sonia to all the most expensive restaurants in that city, in that university city, whereas I was looking for a girlfriend who would cook for me. So I belonged to the impecunious lot, and he belonged to the very privileged lot. And these two worlds never intersected.
So, you know, this is also very interesting that you say that the Cambridge Union was some kind of a training ground or a nursery for your coming into politics, being interested in politics, which has happened to a lot of British politicians. Both the Oxford Union and the Cambridge Union have served as nurseries for many prime ministers and cabinet ministers, or as they say, secretaries in that part of the world. But in that sense, I think you are unique in India, that you claim that the training in the Cambridge Union prepared you for the world of politics in India, which is a completely different world from British politics.
It is. And I can only say that looking back at the careers of South Asians at the two unions, I'm very glad I was not a Sri Lankan. For there were three prominent Sri Lankans at the Oxford Union. Solomon Bandaranayake, who was the treasurer, who was elected treasurer of the Oxford Union. Lalit Atulat Mudali, who was elected the president of the union. Lakshman Kadirgamar, who was elected President of the Union. And what unites these three is that all three were assassinated. So perhaps because I was at the Cambridge Union rather than the Oxford Union, I have not, at least until now, been assassinated. And perhaps had I made the grade, I would have suffered the same fate as my Sri Lankan colleagues. As for those who were with me at the Cambridge Union, they were names that really mattered at the end of the 1980s and the early 90s, but now they've all become lords and nobody talks of them anymore. So their obscurity matches mine. And so I don't think it was useful as an experience in coming into Indian politics, but it was useful as a kind of probation in politics per se. And how did you fight elections? What did you do with skullduggery? What did you do? What were the steps you took to make yourself known? How did you take steps to not make yourself too disliked? What steps did you take to get yourself liked in the right quarters? All these things I did pick up at the Cambridge Union, and it was different to school politics, where I always stood, whenever there was an election, I'd stand. And much of the time I'd lose. But that was a very good training for genuine politics, because in genuine politics, you cannot guarantee, not even if you're Rajiv Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru, can you guarantee that you'll always win. For Nehru, there was 1962. For Rajiv, there was 1989. And for Sonia, there's now been 2014, 2019, 2024. And poor Rahul Gandhi has only known defeat. He's never known victory.
Indira Gandhi, 1977.
And indeed, Indira Gandhi, 77. But then she came back in 1980. And that is where I've said in the book, not perhaps in this one, in the most recent one, that when young people ask me whether they should make a career in politics, I give them two pieces of advice. Number one, don't come into politics until you've had a remunerative professional career. Because if you don't have a remunerative professional career, you'll have to make a commerce of politics. And number two, don't come in if your temperament is such that you seek continued success. That in every other profession, except perhaps speculative business, you'll be at least better off yet tomorrow than you were yesterday. Even if there are some who are much better off and others who are less better off. But everyone in all other professions is better off in 2026 than he or she was in 2023. But in politics, you suddenly get a wave that makes you a cabinet minister. And when you reach the summit is the point at which your descent to the valley begins. And when you hit the valley floor, that is when your ascent to the summit restarts. So you have to be persistent and you have to be able to take setbacks. What is more, I think it's very easy to take success, but success goes to one's head. And it's very difficult to take failure unless there's somebody there to back you. And I couldn't have made my political life without my wife, who was always pulling me down when I was flying like a balloon to bring me back to reality, and who, when things were going wrong, was telling me not to depend upon my public position, but upon who I was to be able to deal with failure.
Yeah, and I must say, Suneet read politics much better than most of you did. When R.K. Dhawan was recalled, she told you, your days are numbered. Yeah. All of you, she said, your days are numbered.
All you guys are finished.
Finished. So it's a remarkable statement to make.
Well, she should have extended it to Rajiv, because the cause of Rajiv's downfall was that against his better judgment, He'd kicked out R.K. Dhawan. He brought him back, and R.K. Dhawan was the one who advised him to follow the BJP road and have that wretched Shilanyas, which finally not only defeated him, but also reversed the Congress ideology and has resulted in our being a party without an ideology today.
The one thing that, after having read the book, it's still a bit unclear to me, your reasons for choosing to be a politician.
Well, I was fascinated with politics at the age of 10. Because when I was 10 or getting to 11 years old, we had the first general election in India. And I've described how I watched with fascination these jeeps running around the place, the flags, the hoardings, the temporary stands from which people would make speeches. I was so taken with that election that in my own class, I was still at Welham School at that stage. That is, I was in primary school.
Prep,
it's called preparatory
school. Yeah.
I held an election in the class, and people were invited to drop their preferences into the ballot boxes. And one very naughty boy called Anand Chakravarti, who I expect is somewhere around, although I haven't seen him for a long time, Anand Chakravarti went up to the blackboard and he wrote on it that Preethinder's mom and pop are commies. And that caused a fight inside the class. And Miss Oliphant walked in, and democracy in Welham School was brought to a complete stop in that election. And after that, while I was at school and later when I was at Cambridge or when I was at Stevens, I was always fascinated by this process of putting yourself before the general public and asking them to decide whether you were a good guy or a bad guy. And very often, they answered by saying that bad guys are good guys and good guys are bad guys. But I did like the thought that the great unwashed public was being asked to judge your merits or your lack of them or your appeal to them. And that seemed to me to be the right way of running a country, which is also why when it's in Stevens, I was taught about Panchayati Raj. I got completely fascinated with the idea of poor people administering themselves instead of being administered by people like me. And that thought just remained in my mind. It germinated as I grew up. It also reflected what my experience was. And then suddenly, I find myself joint secretary to a prime minister who wants grassroots democracy. And all his experts, Gopi Arora, Montek Ahluwalia, said, no, what's this mad thought? And therefore, Rajiv turned to me. And a hope that I had nourished since I was 16 or 17 years old, I was suddenly in a position to actually contribute to the longest and most detailed amendment to the Constitution that has ever been made. And under the stewardship of a young man who was totally enthused by the idea that it is not enough to have democracy at Delhi and in the state capitals. You must take democracy down to the grassroots, because that is the only way in which you can make ordinary people participants in the growth process. And I think the worst thing about the assassination on the 21st of May, 1991, is not that Rajiv was assassinated, because we are all human and we have to die one day, but that Panchayati Raj got assassinated. The idea got. And we have it, I mean, it's on the statute books, it's in the Constitution, it's being implemented in every state, but the kind of enthusiasm that Rajiv brought to this idea of involving the people of India politically and economically in their own development, including their human development, has not been understood, indeed has been actively opposed by most congressmen, and certainly in most state governments that are not run by the Congress. And as far as the BJP is concerned, they're basically hostile to the idea.
So, two interrelated questions following up on this is fascination of for politics, we understand, and where does socialism make an entry? It is also one of the key components of your personal ideological framework. Where does it make an entry, and how does it marry into the idea of the Panchayati Raj?
I think it doesn't, because it was a different formulation in my mind. I think I became a socialist for the most sordid of reasons. It's the most sordid of reasons because my father was killed in an air crash in my first year in school. And my mother found that there was not very much money in the bank or anywhere else. And so we were withdrawn from boarding school in order to economize. And in our home, there was a code of austerity that we were never given any home clothes. So I still remember the exact date, the 16th of June 1957, when an uncle of mine, the husband of my aunt, a man called Mirza, bought me my first colored bush shirt. And I felt like Devanand in CID wearing it. I used to find that at midterm holidays, all the other boys were dressed in the fancy clothes that they would bring from home, whereas I had to wear the white trousers and the white shirt that we were required to wear in the evenings at school. And that gave me a certain inferiority complex vis-a-vis the rich. And everybody at Doon School was a rich boy. And when I looked at them and found that 90% of them were certainly not deserving of the privilege that they had, I began to wonder why the system was absolutely biased in the direction of these useless fellows who were minting money because their parents were rich. And why was it that I was having to live this austere life of a teenager, which I didn't want to live? And then somebody told me that Marx had said, from each according to his ability and to each according to his need. And I was so taken by this remark that I decided I'd become a communist. And then at college in St. Stephen's, there were two Bengali boys who were absolute dyed-in-the-wool communists and forced me to pick up all this ideology and all the slogans of communism, so that till today...
Who were they?
One was a man called Das Gupta, who became my closest ever friend and a prominent member of the Indian Foreign Service.
Oh, Shankar.
Shankar. And the other was a guy called Muzzy, who proved he was a communist by becoming a chartered accountant with Price Waterhouse. So these two false teachers, they would be picking up copies of a magazine called the China Economic Review, which in the middle of the famine that killed at least 30 million Chinese, were feeding me with the bogus figures of the economic progress being made by China. So I was taken up with all this. So much so that when I went to Cambridge, the first thing I did was to join the Marxist Society. And the next thing I did was to ask for special tuitions with a very famous Cambridge communist economist,
Maurice Dobb.
Maurice Dobb. And Hahn, who was my supervisor, was amused at this request, but he wrote to Dobb, and Dobb dropped a message in the Porter's Lodge in my college, asking me to meet him at such and such a time. I went to see Maurice Dobb, Comrade Maurice Dobb, the ideological hero of the left, and he said, I said to him, sir, I can't pay you for your supervisions. He said, supervisions are to be paid for. So, which meant I wouldn't have any time with him. And then he added, but if you'd like a glass of sherry at 6 o'clock every Thursday evening, you're welcome to drop by here. So I started my Shagirdgiri with Maurice Dobb. And then I found that he had feet of clay. And I was therefore a bit surprised to find from Amartya Sen's autobiography that Sen had the highest regard for Maurice Dobb as an economist
Dobb
and
supervised
as an ideologue.
Dobb supervised his PhD thesis.
Did he?
Yeah,
Oh.
choice of
Anyway,
techniques, yes.
He was a good economist, but he couldn't persuade me. And then I read a book. Can I tell the story?
Yes, please.
I read a book by a lady called Claire Sheridan. She was the first cousin of Winston Churchill. And in 1919, after the First World War was over, when Kamenev, who was one of the great revolutionaries of 1917, came across to England, Claire Sheridan, notwithstanding her very distinguished aristocratic background, she belonged to the larger Devonshire family. She walked up to Kamenev, talked to him, and he said, if you're interested in seeing what the revolution is like, then you come along with me. And she describes how she goes to Moscow, lives there for 3 years, from 1919 to 1922. And she's a sculptress. So she does the heads of all the leaders of the Communist Party. And I read it all with fascination. And clearly her favorite is Trotsky. So when her term in Moscow comes to an end, she goes to Trotsky's home to have tea with him. And she describes this beautiful silver set in which the tea is being served. And she feels that she's got sufficiently close to Trotsky to make a very personal remark to him. She says, Comrade Trotsky, I just don't believe all the horrible things they say about you. At which point Trotsky pulls out a pistol, puts it at her temple, and says, if I thought you could harm our cause one whit, I'd shoot you dead here. But as you don't matter, and he puts the pistol back in his pocket, have another cucumber sandwich. I read this, and I said that I can't eat fish. I'm sorry to say this before a Bengali audience, but I can't eat fish because the first time I went into dining hall at Cambridge, and they served this trout, and the beady eye of this trout looked at me with reproach. I just couldn't look at that fish anymore, and I walked out. So I said, I can't eat a dead fish. How am I going to be a communist? And that's one of those Maverick things. In the meanwhile, of course, M.K. Narayan, who was the undersecretary in the Intelligence Bureau, had picked up a couple of British newspapers which he described me as a communist, and then he used that information to persuade everyone below Nehru that I should be kept out of the Foreign Service because I was a dangerous subversive. And thanks to Dr. Radhakrishnan, and ultimately thanks to Jawaharlal Nehru, I have been shown the file, although I shouldn't be, as a cabinet minister by Pranab Mukherjee, which says, I agree. I too have heard good reports of Mani Shankar Aiyar. He may be taken into the Indian Foreign Service and sent to Missouri for his training. Signed J. Nehru, 23 October 1963. And that is the proudest entry I have. That even getting into the Foreign Service, it didn't matter whether I passed the exam or not. It was only because Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister of India and had the broad-mindedness to understand that any Indian has the right to a political opinion, but no civil servant can be the member of a political party, that I managed to get into the service.
Mani, pardon my saying so, I find that initial explanation you gave for your turning to socialism, that is the austerity of your home, a little bit inadequate, because your brother, who came out of the same home, the same austere ambiance, went completely the other way and remains completely the other way.
He went on exactly the same path until about 1968-69, Swami was as much of a socialist as I have remained. And it was George Bernard Shaw who said that any young man who is not a communist at the age of 20 is completely inhuman. But anyone who remains a communist after the age of 25 is completely stupid. So I preferred to remain stupid, not because I had ceased being a communist, because I had ceased being a communist much earlier, but because I was persuaded that Jawaharlal Nehru's socialistic pattern of society was the right path for India to take. And I've always been of the view that the economic reforms that Dr. Manmohan Singh instituted in 1991 might have saved us from sinking into debt, but have had the consequence of making ours one of the most unequal societies in the world. Economically, socially, we were always one of the most, perhaps the most unequal society in the world. And this complete inequality that has overtaken our country has had the consequence of concentrating all our wealth on two people, and these two people, Ambani and Adani, are now determining economic policy. I don't think it's Nirmala Sitharaman who determines where we go. It is Ambani and Adani. And that is also the consequence of having economic reforms without Panchayati Raj. If we'd had economic reforms with Panchayati Raj, then we may have offset several of the consequences of income inequality by having political equality and perhaps a greater concentration of resources on pulling the poor up instead of pushing the rich higher. And that is, I think, the very sad state of our society. And as Rajdeep Sardesai said here this afternoon, without, I think, understanding the implications of what he was saying, it was the creation of an aspirational society by economic reforms that has resulted in the Modi government and all the awful things that have happened to us in the last 10 years and the worst things that are there for us in the future, because in the meanwhile, the Congress, having lost Panchayati Raj, having lost socialism, having lost secularism, having lost non-alignment, is a party without an ideological anchor. And so we're just drifting. Today with Mamta, tomorrow with Akhilesh. This is not ideological politics. And I believe in ideological politics, even if the fashion today is opportunistic politics, which are called transactional politics, as if it is better to be transactional than to be principled.
Mani, one last, and this is a parting provocation, and it is a personal question. The common impression, I italicize common impression, is Mani Shankar Aiyar is facetious, Mani Shankar Aiyar shouldn't be taken seriously, Mani Shankar Aiyar shoots his mouth off at the first possible opportunity. But those of us who know you, and those of us who have heard you this evening, we actually know that Mani Shankar Aiyar is actually a very serious, thinking individual. We might have differences, but that's a different matter, you know. But that Mani has a mind, that's quite obvious from all that you said this evening. And my several interactions with you, private and public, have also convinced me of that. Do you think actually the mask of being the smart aleck one-liner coinages has taken over the most serious individual that is Mani Shankar Aiyar?
Yes, and I've explained that at very great length in my last book, which is the book I thought we'd be discussing, but apparently it's not reached Calcutta yet. In that book, I have explained that all my virtues are what has led me into trouble. Because if I made the grade, it was because of my ease with language. but it is the ease with language, with a foreign language, in a country which barely understands English, apart from the Rudranshus of this world, that twists what I say and doesn't seem to understand that there is irony, there is wit, and all that needs to be taken on its own terms. They make it serious. When I suggested to Rajiv that he should describe the BJP, which had stayed on in the Rajya Sabha after having quit the Lok Sabha over Bofors in 1989, I suggested to him the line that they're still clinging like lemmings to their chairs in the Rajya Sabha. And the minute he said that, they turned up in huge numbers saying, "Kya hame janwar keh rahe hain?" They don't understand. I said that this is a neech kisam ka aadmi. The minute I call him a neech kisam ka aadmi, the man within a few hours is standing on a stage and saying, "वो कह रहे हैं कि मैं नीच जाति का हूँ." Where did I say कि वो नीच जाति के हैं? What is even worse is that the Congress party, without asking me, asks me to apologize. I do against my will, and then I'm sent a suspension letter. I'm suspended from the party because Modi says that I've said he's of neech jat, when what I've said is that he's a neech kisam ka aadmi. I was referring to his character. And why was I referring to his character? Because he had said, he inaugurated the Ambedkar Bhavan, and that's just that morning. And in doing that, he had made the statement कि ये बाबा, talking about Rahul, he said कि ये बाबा साहब के बारे में क्या जानते हैं जबकि बाबा भोलेनाथ के पीछे भाग रहे हैं. This is the reference to Rahul going to all these temples and claiming Shiv as his Ish Devta. So I said, what kind of politics is this? Where you talk of Baba Ambedkar and then say Baba Bholenath. So I said कि ये नीच किस्म का आदमी है. I was referring to his character. And yet the Congress party suspends me and doesn't give me a hearing. So in the Congress party itself, there is the same view that, you know, he's very loose. Sonia Gandhi was told that of all the congressmen in the country, the one who was held in the greatest affection by the people of Kashmir was me. And who was it who said it? It was Saifuddin Soz, who was the president of the J&K Congress. And Sonia's reaction to him, and I've talked about it either in this book or the later one, she said, "But how can I make him the general secretary? He's such a loose cannon." So I think I got an image that had something to do with reality, but was not the total of reality. And I have been, I think, very unfairly treated, but I brought it upon myself. With the gift of the gab, I'm able to make lots of friends. But it's the same quality that enables me to make friends that also enables me to make enemies. And this being so, it is character which is destiny. And in my character was inbuilt this maverick tendency to say serious things in a light manner and to say light things in a serious manner. So I'm afraid I can't run away from myself. One of my favorite lines in poetry is Lawrence Durrell's translation of C.P. Cavafy, The City, where he says, "No ship exists to take you from yourself." So there is no ship in the world that can take me away from myself. I am what I am. I think I've summed it up by saying I'm a maverick, and being a maverick means that you take the rough with the smooth, because a great deal of what is smooth does come one's way for the same reason that the smooth then sails away and you're left stranded on the seashore.
Mani, I know you once told a Harvard man you went to Cambridge Mass, I went to Cambridge Elite. as somebody who did not go to either of the Cambridges, it's been a real privilege being your friend and having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I think they want some questions. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
But keep them short. We don't want a counter talk.
Good evening, sir. Truly, you are a maverick, and seeing the trajectory in your career, in your life, born in Pakistan, St. Stephen, Cambridge, and diverse portfolio, petroleum, Northeast, youth affair, everything. Just, I wish to touch upon that. You constantly persuaded peace between India and Pakistan. So when you visit your birthplace, and now what you see that in future, what lies in the bag for India and Pakistan?
Thank you for that question. As I've said in my book, I think the third one, which is not before us, Pakistan has been my magnificent obsession. Ever since I was posted there as the first ever Indian Consul General in the period 1978 to 1982, and significantly, it was a BJP minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who as foreign minister, picked me to be sent to Karachi. And the experience of the Pakistanis over a 3-year period was that far from being the most difficult people to deal with, they were easily the most easy people that I ever dealt with in my long 26-year career as a diplomat. Because you don't need to have an interpreter, you don't need to have a statement of what is your nature of your country, the history of your country, the culture of your country. It's only the accident of partition that has made them a different country. And for the rest, they are very much like us. They have their special characteristics, but then I would say there's much more difference between me as a Tamil and my wife as a Punjabi than between her and a Pakistani Punjabi. So in these terms, we ought to be able to easily talk to them. But for some reason, we have the courage to undertake surgical strikes. But this government doesn't have the courage to sit across a table with them. For 10 years, we've had no interaction with Pakistan at all. And we keep talking of them as if all of them were terrorists. Yeah, Pakistan is a country which spreads terror, but it is also the biggest victim of terror. They thought they could bring the Taliban into power in Afghanistan. Today, their single biggest threat is the Taliban in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. So in these circumstances, I think Dr. Manmohan Singh, it's one characteristic of his that has not been talked about, except by me, which is that I think his single biggest achievement was to ensure that we did talk to Pakistan on the back channel, arrived at what Musharraf called the 4-point agreement on Kashmir, and he also showed that it is possible to talk business with a military government in Pakistan. Now, these two things have stood in the way. We've said, what's the point of talking to the Pakistanis? And we've said, how can we talk to the military? Well, Manmohan Singh showed that if you did talk to them, you could come to a conclusion, and that it's easily possible. Indeed, experience shows it's easier to talk to a military government than it is to a civilian government, because a civilian government has to continuously go back to its people, whereas a military government can take a decision. So Zia, in fact, Rajiv Gandhi is on record as having told Sunday magazine, that was an interview with Veer Sanghvi and Avik Sarkar in 1990, the year after he was defeated. He said it was much easier to deal with Zia's government than it was with Benazir's, because with Zia you knew that his last word was the last word of Pakistan, whereas with Benazir you knew that her last word was the first word with Pakistan. So therefore, I think it is suicidal for us to continue wearing Pakistan around our necks as if it was an albatross. We should just talk to them, and as Manmohan Singh proved on the issue of Kashmir, it is possible, it is feasible. Indeed, I think it is easy to arrive at it, to solve all the really difficult issues. And if you do that, the low-hanging fruit will fall of their own accord. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. It's been a very long day, so we'll bring the curtain down this evening. Thank you, Mani, once again. And come back soon to Calcutta.